Marcia has produced a large body of knowledge in the areas of political and legal anthropology. I really wish I'd studied anthropology at university, but maybe I'll do that when I retire. And in the areas of Aboriginal arts and culture. She's published and presented on Indigenous agreements and engagement with the minerals industry, the Aboriginal lands tenure, native title and Indigenous resource management. She has, of course, also worked for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, several government inquiries, and, most importantly for our subject tonight, co-chaired the Voice Co-Design Senior Advisory Group with Professor John Cain. In 2016, Professor Langton was honoured as a Redmond Valley Distinguished Professor at the University of Melbourne, where she's been the Associate Provost since May 2017. And in addition to her many academic publications, she's an award-winning author, and of course her books, I can say that here tonight for about another half an hour, and her most recent publication with Professor Aaron Cole, I believe, is Law, the Way of the Ancestors. She's here tonight to talk to us about the upcoming referendum on the Voice to Parliament, a critically important moment for our nation. Please make Professor Marcia Langton very welcome.
I acknowledge the traditional owners, the peoples of the Kulin Nation. I believe we're within the Wurundjeri boundaries here, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and the ancestors in this place. The late John Cain, in whose honour I'm delivering this oration, and I don't need to tell you any of this, but I do want to pay my respects, was Victoria's 41st Premier from 1982 to 1990 as leader of the Labor Party. Having looked more closely at his record, I'm tremendously impressed with his reformist achievements, a huge swag of achievements that others should be jealous of. And after he quit politics, he was appointed a professorial fellow in politics at the University of Melbourne in 1991. Among other things, writing 3 books and critiquing the university's turn to a neoliberal market-driven model. His Keynesian approach to economic and social matters and concern for environmental, education and health and well-being issues are a part of his legacy, along with equal opportunity initiatives and occupational health and safety legislation. His public works are another of his important legacies. Mr. Cain established the Victorian Women's Trust, now run by Mary Crooks, demonstrating his commitment to gender equality. I feel sure that if he were alive today, he would vote yes in the referendum to be held on October 14. So my task this evening is to talk about the referendum question on Indigenous constitutional recognition and the voice, a body that Prime Minister Albanese has increasingly referred to as an advisory committee, or committee. This necessarily, telling the story necessarily involves history, including deep history. Let me start with the deep history. The ancestors of present-day Indigenous Australians arrived in Northern Australia at least 65,000 years ago, according to archaeologist Chris Clarkson and his team, who investigated Mudgett Beatty in Arnhem Land. In less than 230 years, the first distinct Australians have been reduced to the most disadvantaged Australians. Colonised by the British in 1788, our peoples were almost wiped from the face of the earth by a brutal rolling frontier over more than a century of sustained warfare that ended only in the 20th century, and the epidemics of new diseases that came with the British, such as smallpox, influenza and measles. As a descendant of the Imam people who were massacred in the hundreds over decades of conflict, raised in Queensland under racist laws and now in my 70s, it is clear to me that the winds of change blowing across our continent now are our last hope of surviving as the First Peoples. More recent history is also relevant to the debate about the referendum question that poses constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the First Peoples by establishing a voice to Parliament and the executive government. I will return to more recent events later. Aboriginal people were totally excluded from the Constitution that came into effect in 1901 in this very city by specific clauses that cast out diverse peoples with, we think, more than 600 language varieties as a race. Although amended in 1967 following that famous referendum to remove two racist references from the Constitution, it still retains two racist clauses: the race power at section 51(26) and section 25. I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with it, but let me just go through it. The race power gives the It gives the Australian Parliament the power to pass laws that may cause us harm. And section 25 is a hangover from the White Australia policy of limiting voting rights for non-whites. So section 25 remains an existential threat. 51(26) remains an existential threat to us because, as a matter of common law decided in the Cartignery case, it was held by the High Court that changes to the race power made by the 1967 referendum did not confine its use to the making of beneficial laws. For at least 30 years, Indigenous leaders have sought constitutional reform to overcome this existential threat that the often hostile Parliament, dominated by the majority white members, poses to us. During those 30 years, at least 4 federal Indigenous consultative bodies have been established and then dismantled on political whims. With each election, the advances we make are swept away with new and increasingly unhinged policies in which we have had no say. We were ignored and pilloried until Prime Minister Albanese announced last year his commitment to the message of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I don't need to tell you that Australia's constitution is extraordinarily difficult to change. I was too young to vote in the referendum in 1967 that most affected my people. I watched the older Aboriginal people campaign, though, and we owe a great debt to them. Australians voted overwhelmingly in favour of removing 2 racist references, one that excluded the natives from being counted in the census, and the other that disallowed the federal government from making laws for Aboriginal people. The states, the former colonies until 1901, when they federated under the Constitution, had absolute power and practiced formal racist segregation and forced assimilation. And in the case of Western Australia, the Australian Human Rights Commission inquiry into the forced removal of Aboriginal children found that what happened in that state accords with one of the sections in the Convention on Genocide. The result of bizarre policies is worsening social and economic conditions for Indigenous people who number about 800,000 and are the poorest, sickest and most marginalised Australians. At the first and only Indigenous Constitutional Convention in 2017, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was agreed by 250 Indigenous delegates and directed to the Australian people, calling for a voice, treaty and truth-telling. It is a powerful poetic statement addressing our existential crisis. Here are some of its words. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk into the worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. And it was at the Garma Festival in July last year that the Prime Minister announced his commitment to the statement. Since then, the question has been refined by the Referendum Working Group, chaired by Minister Linda Burney, along with Attorney General Mark Dreyfus and other parliamentary members and senators. 21 Indigenous leaders from around the country have advised the Albanese government on each step of the legal process required to alter the Constitution. So the referendum question acknowledges more than 60 millennia of Indigenous history and honours the commitment by the current Australian government to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart with respect to the voice. The statement was the culmination of a nationwide consultative process involving more than 1,200 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across 12 regional dialogues established by the Referendum Council to consider constitutional reform. It was an invitation to the Australian people, not to politicians, not to Parliament, but to the Australian people. The statement fits easily onto one page. Related but separate documentation includes a 26-page summary of what was said by the delegates at the 12 dialogues held leading up to the convention at Uluru. A new chapter would be inserted into the Constitution if the referendum is successful. This would occur only in the case of a double majority, that is, a national majority of voters in the states and a majority of voters in at least 4 out of 6 states. When voters go to their polling booths, they will receive other material with their voting papers, specifically the detail of the new chapter that will be included in the Constitution. The detail in the new chapter makes it very clear that the composition, functions, powers and procedures of this advisory body will be legislated by the Parliament. I want to make it very clear that the proposition in the question that reflects accurately the majority view of Indigenous Australians is the barest measure imaginable that would give Indigenous Australians a formal say in policies and legislation that affect them. It is not a radical proposal. Far from it. It seems relatively simple at first reading, but what it represents is profound. More than symbolic recognition, which of itself is important, crucially important for us, the voice would bring about meaningful change for our peoples. The disadvantages faced by the majority of Indigenous Australians are extreme by any measure. The Closing the Gap strategy, agreed by the Australian governments in 2007 and renewed with more robust targets in 2017, has seen limited progress. Despite years of effort, there has been reportable progress on only 2 educational targets, and parity is a distant prospect on present trends. The verdict of the latest report is damning. Achieving equality in life expectancy and closing the gap within a generation is not on track to be met by 2031. Our people still have a lower life expectancy than non-Indigenous Australians, by 8 years on average, but much greater in remote and rural regions. Other statistics that I think you need to be aware of as you consider how you will vote in the referendum relate to incarceration. We make up about 3% of the entire Australian population, but our people account for 32% of the entire prison population. Our unemployment rates are about 3 times the rates of non-Indigenous people, and infant mortality remains far too high in one of the richest nations on earth. And in fact, the gap in infant mortality is worsening because non-Indigenous infants are doing better and better and leaving us behind. Lives are at stake, and I mean that very literally. However, the voice will not be able to make laws. It will only be able to advise. And of course, there's no requirement that governments accept that advice. However, if politicians and government officials accept the advice, it is more likely that they will make better decisions. If the people in the local communities whose experiences those policymakers largely do not share are able to have their voices heard. This is needed to tackle the extreme and worsening disadvantages faced by a majority of Indigenous Australians in areas, as I say, ranging from child mortality to incarceration rates. A formalised, permanent say on policies is key to achieving parity. The race power, which as I say remains in the Constitution, is based on the specious and discredited 19th century pseudoscience of racial difference. We Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples define ourselves according to our lineages and cultures that tie us to places and ways of life that existed long before colonisation. I was a member of the expert panel on constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, appointed by Prime Minister Julia Gillard. Our panel wrote a substantial report and presented it to Prime Minister Julia Gillard in 2012. We recommended a referendum to remove Section 51, 26 and 25 from the Constitution because they are racist. Her government and Tony Abbott's government each rejected the expert panel's recommendations in that regard, and in fact all of the recommendations. So here we are, more than 10 years later, proposing a simple advisory committee enshrined in the Constitution as a vehicle for symbolic recognition and a practical mechanism for overcoming the burden of history, with the aspiration of limiting the power of Parliament to make laws under the race power that might cause us harm if our advice is taken. We hope that this initiative will bring reconciliation to the nation, reduce divisions, and most importantly, empower First Peoples to have a formal say in their self-determination and participation in government decisions. This is not intended to make Australians feel guilty about the often painful past of Australia's settlement and treatment of Indigenous people. To the contrary, the intention is to unite Australians in what Noel Pearson has referred to as completing the Commonwealth by including and recognising Indigenous people in its rule book. Pamphlets have been distributed by the government to every household, setting out the case for voting yes and for voting no. These have been written by parliamentarians. There is no law or mechanism for ensuring that the yes vote material or the no vote material is accurate. When various media outlets and fact-check services have examined this material, the finding is invariably that the yes case is entirely accurate and the no case is substantially false. So I urge you to do your own reading. There is an enormous amount of detail available. You merely have to ask Uncle Google to find the referendum question and articles by respected High Court judges and constitutional experts such as Campaign's Brett Walker, or George Williams and Megan Davis, or Anne Toomey, so that you can be accurately informed. Both the S23 and Uluru Statement websites provide a wealth of resources about the history and intent of the question you will answer at the polling booth. In 1967 there were 2 questions, and as you know, the outcome of that referendum to remove the 2 racist clauses was astonishing. 90.77% of voters voted in favour of that constitution alteration, and that was the highest yes vote ever recorded in a federal referendum. Let me read to you the first few paragraphs of the speech by Prime Minister Harold Holt the day after the referendum in 1967, as a comparison to the debate that we have to listen to now. Result of referendum, comment by the Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Holt. On the Aborigine question, I was delighted with the overwhelming vote in every state of the Commonwealth favouring the elimination of those references in the Constitution which smack of discrimination. The grant of power to the Commonwealth in relation to Aborigines which follows from the vote will enable it to play a useful part in ensuring justice and social acceptance for people of the Aboriginal race. The vote will not only help the Aborigine, it will contribute to Australia's international standing by demonstrating to the outside world our overwhelming desire to give full acceptance to the Aboriginal people within our community. He goes on to talk about the failure of the Nexus proposal to succeed, but again, in elegant and straightforward terms. Young Australians will have no memory of the last referendum, almost a quarter of a century ago, when a tortured, tricky debate against the Republic was prosecuted by the then Prime Minister John Howard. In 1999, the majority voted against the question, becoming a republic, about the question of our nation becoming a republic, with 45% in favour and 55% against. Australia remains a monarchy under King George III, King of the United Kingdom and Australia. John Howard conned the voters into believing that he would hold a second referendum. While the Republican question lost, younger voters will have a clear memory of the same-sex marriage plebiscite. The electorate did vote overwhelmingly in the affirmative in 2017 in the plebiscite by postal survey. The proposition was carried by almost 62% of the voters. The Republican movement lost the referendum because Howard confused the yes voters into believing that there was a better model. They should vote no for the question being put to them and wait for the next referendum to vote for a better model. They are now boomers, and it is highly unlikely they will ever see Australia become a republic. Opposition leader Peter Dutton ruled out this tactic in his announcement on the weekend, on Saturday, that a government led by him would hold a second referendum on the question of constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. His arguments were as tortured and tricky as were Howard's, almost a quarter of a century ago. Strangely, he said it was long-standing policy that the coalition had taken to previous elections. I've counted 3 elections where they've taken that policy to the voters, but yet have never held a referendum. And so the next election will be the 4th, and I doubt that you will ever see another referendum on this matter. Of course, he's been criticised, notably by Yes campaigner Kirsty Parker, who pointed out that Dutton complained about the cost of the Voice referendum while also proposing to hold a second referendum. This demonstrates, she said, that the opposition leader is not listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are very clearly asked for something that will change our lives. And he proposes to spend the same amount of money on something that would not change our lives. Now we know that he and David Littleproud have committed their parties to the hard no case for the question, and yet we saw this flip on the weekend with Littleproud and his crew, including Jacinta Price, suddenly, after months of campaigning against the proposition, saying that they would support a second referendum. Of course, one of their claims is that the present proposal will racially divide the nation and create two classes of Australians based on race. These lies are effective with a growing minority. Few Australians have knowledge of their national constitution, and even less about the idea of the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples. Yet how would their referendum question not be racially divisive if this one is? So Jackie Lambie got it right again by pointing out that there was no detail. Where's the detail? The Guardian newspaper revealed that the No campaign is working with companies that appear to specialise in conservative Christian campaigning, including a US headquartered marketing and fundraising firm that aims to help Christian non-profit ministries and which play a role in the white Christian nationalist movement in riots in the USA. And we saw one of their United States companies sponsoring the Conservative Political Action Conference in Sydney, Give, Send and Go. And that's the same company that's been raising money for neo-fascists. So as we've seen, Peter Dutton's lies are effective. Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price lie too, and their lies are particularly effective. The advertisement, the cartoon placed by the No campaign, published in the Australian Financial Review, was very much in the style of the United States racism, and was withdrawn after complaints were made, but one has to wonder what led the Australian Financial Review to publish that. At the Conservative Political Action Conference, which is chaired by Warren Mundine, attended by Jacinta Price, Tony Abbott and other Conservatives, the participants were treated to an American comedian who took up the stance of David Littleproud and Jacinta Price in deriding the Welcome to Country ritual. Rodney Marks, who was billed on Sunday's agenda as Dr. Cain Oration, which is some kind of pun, I've forgotten what it is, but it's, both anti-Semitic and racist, but anyway. He purported to be a United Nations diplomat and unloaded on a cheering, laughing audience members this: I'd like to acknowledge the traditional rent seekers, past, present and emerging. But seriously, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, violent black men. I hope there are some real feminists in the audience who appreciate the part truth of that joke. He went on to make disparaging comments about the Indigenous namesakes of the suburbs, Bennelong and Barangaroo. In the face of widespread outrage, the official CPAC Australian Twitter account wrote, "Cheer up, Buttercup," with a thumbs up emoji. Several phrases used by those opposed to our proposition caught my eye and tell me a great deal about how they perceive us. First, Peter Dutton used the term squalor during his interview with Annabelle Crabb in her TV program Kitchen Cabinet, broadcast recently. After a rant about the Constitution, the High Court, legalities, etc., Crabb tried to change course "What blows you away about Indigenous culture?" she asked. "It's the squalor," he said. This is interesting, she said, because I was asking you about First Nations Indigenous culture, and you've gone straight to law and order. And then another term he used in answer to that was underbelly. In opposing the question, John Howard appealed to the voters by saying, "Maintain the rage." What exactly does he mean? Well, let's look at some of his policies and executive actions. After disestablishing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission in 2004 with a barrage of insults, lies and abuse about the commissioners and the effectiveness of the body, he led a new nationwide approach to funding distributed by his government to Indigenous projects. This policy was called mutual obligation. In a wonderful article in the Medical Journal of Australia, Aboriginal health experts describe exactly how the policy breached human rights and the National Health and Medical Research Council research guidelines. Let me tell you about the first shared responsibility agreement setting out mutual obligation. It was imposed on the Mulan Aboriginal community in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. So, this was the deal. The federal government will contribute $172,000 for the installation of fuel houses at Mulan. The government of Western Australia will undertake to monitor and review the adequacy of health services in an area where trachoma rates, causes blindness, are arguably the worst in the world. The Mulan Aboriginal community residents will ensure children shower daily and wash their faces twice a day, ensure rubbish bins at every house are emptied twice weekly through the local Work for the Doles scheme, undertake household pest control 4 times a year, etc. And I have to say that these words, squalor, maintain the rage, ensure children shower daily and wash their faces twice a day, are starting to remind me of an historical document that, labelled one group of people contemptible. So here we are, policy after policy, which basically classes us as unclean, contemptible, dirty, unhygienic. In other words, a race of people who threaten Howard and Dutton society. And as leaders of the Liberal Party have a long track record of accusing us as a people, as a race, not as individuals, of being corrupt. This old colonial trope, the dirty thieving blacks. I'm reminded by Michael Pascoe, writing in the New Daily, that Peter Dutton is the descendant of the frontier squattocracy of Queensland. His ancestor, Charles Boydell Dutton, was Queensland's Secretary for Lands in the mid-1880s, and his central Queensland seat had been the site of the Colin massacre, the largest single killing of white colonists, 19 men, women and children. That was in revenge for the murder of Guyary men by a neighbouring squatter. And in revenge for Colin Larungo, some 370 Guyary men, women and children were killed. To be fair, he only inherited a 68-hectare farm. But let me proceed. We should not forget that morning in 2007 when we woke to find that John Howard had sent the Australian Defence Forces into Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory under the guise of protecting Aboriginal children from sexual abuse. And so the Northern Territory emergency intervention legislation, which ran 500 pages, suspended the Racial Discrimination Act and required alcohol to be banned in some regions for 6 months, X-rated porn outlawed in communities and on public computers, the need for outsiders to have permits to get into townships and roads scrapped, every Aboriginal child under 16 required to have a medical check-up at federal expense, states asked to donate 10 police officers each to boost the uniform presence in each community, working alongside federal bureaucrats sent to live in selected regions as town managers. There are actually 76 discrete communities. Their land was taken over by the Commonwealth and put under Commonwealth leases for 50 years. Secondly, payments were quarantined at 50%, and the list goes on. And it's very clear that the overwhelming evidence is that those interventions caused great harm, particularly in destroying the trust of Aboriginal people in all sorts of institutions, including clinics, police, hospitals, and government in general. So perhaps I've gone on for too long. But just one more thing. Peter Dutton continues to complain that there is no detail about the voice. Yes, there are details. The details won't be included in the Constitution. It is the Parliament's role to legislate the structure, powers and any other related matter. But you know that. But of course, his aim is to sow confusion and doubt. I did serve with Professor Tom Calmer as the co-chair of the Senior Advisory Group of the Voice Co-Design Group, and we presented 2 reports to Morrison's Cabinet in which Peter Dutton was a member. Both times, both the reports were released from Cabinet for public consultation. We're very clear that the bureaucracy is making our lives worse. The bureaucracy exists to measure, categorise and report. It is administered largely by well-paid public servants. Their business is to write memos and reports. They are responsible to the Minister for Indigenous Affairs of the day, and in the past, as we know, ministers have had little regard for reforms to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians. If they do activate the check-writing processes, they do so more often to pay the army of consultants producing feasibility reports and evaluations. We are governed by the suffocating atmosphere of the welfare state, the protection state that addresses itself to an old paradigm of the mendicant natives, and, as we can see, the dirty natives. I encourage you to read the final report of the Voice Co-Design process. If we're successful in this referendum, it is our hope that this final report will be the basis for the legislation to follow. We recommended up to 35 regional bodies, self-determined, conforming with 9 principles such as gender equity, transparency, accountability, cultural authority and so on, and appointing from the states and territories people to a national voice made up of about 24 people, including 5 people from remote areas, with 2 permanent advisory bodies, 1 for youth and 1 for the disabled. There's a summary of all of our recommendations starting at about page 16. A great deal has been said about the corruption of ASIC, and the myth is peddled constantly by the media. However, I finally found the one prosecution, and it was not for fraud or corruption. It was Ray Robinson, one of the National Commissioners, and of course a local commissioner, who was prosecuted following a special audit of ASIC, which did not uncover any instances of fraud. There were allegations in the media against Jeff Clark and Ray Robinson. Howard's people put it out there that they'd engaged in criminal acts and fraud. And Mark Latham, as the leader of the ALP, announced that the ALP would abolish ATSIC if it won government. The Howard government did abolish ATSIC in 2004. But as I say, it was only Ray Robinson who was prosecuted. But it's a very strange charge. It's not about corruption or fraud. It has to do with accounting requirements. And the Act was so strange and vague on accounting requirements that nobody could really fix the problem, including the wonderful chairperson, first chairperson who complained about it, the wonderful Lord Joe O'Donoghue. And of course, it's my suspicion that John Howard shut ATSIC down because it had started an inquiry into how treaties could be written, and he was implacably opposed. And at the time, they were doing a very good job and had started a national housing audit. And to this day, even Minister Linda Burney raises housing as a key social determinant, which we expect that the Voice will address itself to. I think you'll find our recommendations in our report very interesting and should give you cause for hope too that we can close the gap. We recommended, for instance, that the written advice of the National Voice land in Parliament with a committee, much like the Bill Scrutiny Committee. And they would also give advice to executive government at any time, because policy begins as a thought bubble and it may take many years before it ends up as legislation. So here we are with 6 weeks to convince a confused and sceptical majority that what we're proposing is going to be good for the nation, it's going to be good for Aboriginal people. We envisage a nation founded on recognition of us as the First Peoples, not pests to be eradicated. We envisage a nation in which our legitimate leaders are able to give formal advice to the Parliament and executive government to improve our lives. Will this stop the media from chasing the extremists as representatives of our peoples? No. But most Australians will know who the members of the National Advisory Committee are and support their advice. Will we close the gap on the alarming array of disadvantages immediately? No. But the National Advisory Committee and the regional committees will be able to recommend effective measures that will more quickly close these gaps. This is because of the enormous issue of trust. And I've given you a few examples of of events that cause the trust of Aboriginal people in governments to sink to lower and lower levels. Why would Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people believe that governments have our best interests at heart when the overwhelming evidence shows the contrary by and large? Most don't. This is why the close the gap outcomes are so disappointing. People will not see doctors or send their children to school. An Indigenous voice will be able to rebuild the trust necessary to engage a substantial majority in pathways to better life outcomes. A majority yes vote is important for our children and future generations. Why wouldn't you vote yes to give us a say in reaching parity in life expectancy for our children and future generations?